This is Chris with Phoenix Gaming. Today we're going to talk about Warhammer the Old World and we're going to look at magic. We're going to talk about what magic is and who can use it, wizards and levels, lores, spells and generation, casting, and we're even going to touch on miscasts and dispelling, things of that nature. Before we begin, I'd like to say thank you to all of you for watching. If you like Old World like I do, and you like movement trays like I do, the links below for movement trays are trays that will work with your round-based models or your square-based models. The one on the left is going to be for 25 millimeter rounds. It's a 5x2 tray by Litco, and the one on the right is for 20 millimeter square bases. So you wouldn't necessarily have to rebase your models because those are made specifically with the right size footprint in mind. First of all, what is magic and who can use it? Magic is its own special interaction in the old world. Only wizards can manipulate the winds of magic. Of course, there are exceptions to this. This is a Games Workshop game, and no Games Workshop game is complete without exceptions to almost every rule. Each phase has a special subphase in which players can use wizards to cast spells. In most cases, only wizards can cast, and only wizards can dispel. Let's take a look at wizards. Each wizard has a spell level that represents their overall power in the game. Level 1 wizards are novice and represent the newest, youngest wizards. These are going to be, along with level 2, the most common wizards in the game. Level 2 wizards would have more experience under their belt, and again, they are fairly common. Once we start hitting wizards of level 3, we're talking about beings that are very powerful and mighty and almost at the pinnacle of what you could get. And then obviously level 4 wizards are going to be extremely rare. In game, they're going to be very expensive in terms of points, and their power and their impact on a game could be very high. The wizard level will determine a modifier for spell casting as well as how many spells are known by the wizard. There are different lores, which are schools if you're a Dungeons and Dragons player. That's all that refers to. And each lore represents a different discipline of magic, and the spells within that lore are themed accordingly. If you have a fire lore wizard, it's going to have fire-based magic. It's going to be very intuitive and it will make sense. Each lore will have seven spells. Each lore will have 7 spells. 6 of them will be numbered 1 through 6. One of them will be your signature spell, and that's in addition to the other 6. When a wizard selects spells, they must choose one lore and generate all spells from that lore. Roll 1 die per wizard level, so a level 3 wizard would roll 3 dice, for example. The number on the die corresponds to what spells they know. So if you rolled a 1, a 3, and a 6, you would know the first, the third, and the sixth spells in that lore. You are allowed to discard one spell and replace it with your signature spell from the lore. You do not get to cherry pick your spells in Fantasy or Old World the way you used to in 40K or in Sigmar, and spells are rolled for or generated before both armies are deployed. And I assume if you're going to an event, that just means it's rolled pregame. So every match you'll just roll for new spells. Spells fall into one of 6 categories, and these will determine the type of spell and when they are cast. Enchantments and hexes are cast in the strategy phase, and these are in the conjuration step of the strategy phase specifically, and they will typically be buffs and debuffs. Conveyance spells are cast in the movement phase, and these will be spells that represent things like the jump or Hand of Gork that would teleport or buff mobility. Magic Missile and Magical Vortex spells are cast in the shooting phase, and these tend to be direct damage style spells, with vortex spells usually being a little bit more of an AoE. Assailment spells are cast in the combat phase, and those tend to be very deadly attacks, and they will only usually affect units that are within engagement range of the caster. It is important to take note of when they are cast because it's not covered very well in the core rules. Effectively, there's just a tiny little paragraph that you have to really dig for to find that breaks it all down for you. So I would make a note of this so that you don't forget. When casting, choose a wizard on the table. That wizard can cast any of its spells that are appropriate to the current phase. For example, it could cast vortex or magic missile spells in the shooting phase when you would select him to shoot. It casts any or all of its spells that are relevant to the current phase. So if you have multiple spells, you cast them with that one wizard before you move on. And it does so by choosing the spell you want to cast. You choose your target. The target must be in your line of sight arc, but you don't need line of sight to the target. And what that means is if the wizard is skirmish, it's a 360-degree arc. Otherwise, if it's rank and file, it will have a 45-degree coming from the front arc. It must be within the spell's range. So if it's a range self, it only affects himself. If it has 18 inches, the target must be within 18 inches. Spells cannot target units engaged in combat, excluding assailment spells and any spells that specifically state otherwise. And if the wizard is in engagement range, it cannot cast except for assailment and any spells that say otherwise. Once the spell is chosen and targets are selected, the wizard then makes a casting roll. You'll roll 2d6 or 2 dice and add the wizard's level to the dice roll. A level 2 wizard, for example, would roll 2d6 plus 2. If the dice roll meets or beats the casting value of the spell is successfully cast. If the total roll does not meet or beat the casting value of the spell, the attempt fails. Regardless of if it fails, the wizard may only attempt each of their spells once. If an enemy unit is the target of one of your spells and that unit has magic resistance X, then X is treated as a penalty to the casting roll. This is not cumulative. If for whatever reason you have 2 instances of magic resistance in a unit, you'll take the worst modifier. So if there's somebody with magic resistance 1 and somebody with magic resistance 3 in the same unit, you would apply the -3 penalty. I will touch on this a little bit more, but if you roll double ones to cast, it is a miscast, and then double sixes is a perfect invocation. If it is cast, then before resolving the spell, if there is an enemy wizard within range, they may attempt to dispel the spell. If you don't have any wizards able to attempt to dispel a spell, you can instead choose to perform a fated dispel. We're going to touch on this in just a second because the rules are kind of unclear on the fated dispel. If you're doing a wizardly dispel, you pick a single wizard within dispel range and attempt a wizardly dispel. The range is based on wizard level. So if your wizard is level 1 or 2, you have an 18-inch dispel range. If it's 3 or 4, you have a 24-inch dispel range. Wizards engaged in combat or not on the battlefield may not attempt a dispel. A fated dispel, like I said, this worded kind of weird. Once per turn, if you don't have any wizards able to make a wizardly dispel, and that's how it's worded in the book. But then it says, or if you wish to avoid the risk, you may instead attempt a fated dispel. So it sounds like you can just always attempt one fated dispel per phase. It does feel weird to say you can only do it and then add the clause that invalidates it. And what I think the intent here is that you just always have access to a fated dispel, but you only get one per phase, not per turn, as it says on the screen. To dispel, make a dispel roll. Roll 2d6, adding wizard level for wizardly dispels. There are no modifiers for fated dispels. If the dispel roll is greater than the casting roll, the spell is dispelled and immediately ends with no effect. If the dispel roll was less than or equal to the casting attempt, the spell resolves normally. If double sixes that are natural are rolled when dispelling, the spell is dispelled immediately regardless of the casting result, and that's being outclassed in the art. And if double ones, natural, are rolled when dispelling, the dispelling wizard immediately rolls on the miscast table. We will get into miscasts and all that in just a moment. Once a spell is cast, it is resolved immediately, assuming it was successful and not dispelled. Most spells are resolved instantly with no further effect. If this is not the case, it will tell you when its effects ends. So there are spells that will say until the end of your turn, blah, 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 or you gain this until the next start of turn subphase, etc. So if it doesn't resolve instantly, it will tell you when it does end. Spells that have remains in play, these spells remain in effect indefinitely when cast. They only come to an end if the caster is slain, if the caster chooses to end the spell, which they can do at the start of any subphase, and then the caster, if it leaves the battlefield for any reason, the spell also ends. The caster may still cast other spells, but it may not cast the same remains in play spell. And there was an FAQ that it clarified this a little bit, saying you actually could attempt it, but what would happen is that the old spell effect would end and the new one would take its place. You may attempt to dispel a remains in play spell cast by your opponent during the conjuration subphase of your subsequent turns after it is cast, and it will follow the normal dispel rules. What this means is that, yes, you can attempt to dispel it as it's being cast. You can also attempt to dispel it in your subsequent conjuration phases. To dispel an already in play, remains in play spell, you just need to beat the spell's casting value, not the original roll. So once that remains in play spell is on the table, its dispel target number is now beat the casting value, not beat the original dice roll. Remains in play spells that are cast with perfect invocation, meaning double sixes, may not be dispelled as they are cast, but may only be dispelled in subsequent conjuration phases as stated above. If you're casting a remains in play spell and you spike that roll and get dub sixes, your opponent cannot try to dispel it. Even if they got dub sixes, they can't try to dispel it because they don't get to roll those dice. But what they could do is in their next turn, they could try to dispel it in their conjuration phase, just like we said. Miscasts are when you roll double ones, whether casting or dispelling. Generally speaking, the spell attempt will fail. Obviously, there's exceptions to everything. And then you would roll on the miscast table. When you do the miscast table roll, you'll roll 2d6 and consult the table on page 109 of the core rules. We're not going to dig through the miscast table. It's there. It's on 109. A lot of them are pretty funny, but we're not going to go through them. In addition, some wizards or characters or models will have access to bound spells. Bound spells are typically like a Ring of Fireball, where the spell itself is on a magic item, not being cast by the character. They are still cast in the same manner. You'll roll 2d6 and you won't get any modifiers for a bound spell unless the bound spell has a power level given, at which point the power level becomes the modifier. There's no risk of miscast or perfect invocation for bound spells. They can be dispelled as normal, and magic items that dispel or destroy spells work normally against bound spells. One model can only cast a single bound spell per phase. So even if you had 3 different bound spells, if they're all magic missiles and magic vortex, you could still only pick one of those 3 because they cast in the same phase. Now, if you had a spell that cast in the strategy phase and a spell that cast in the shooting phase and they were both bound, you could still use both of those in the same turn. You just can't use them again in the same phase. When you have a bound spell or you cast a bound spell, that does not make you a wizard, so you wouldn't trigger anything that specifically triggers from wizards. Another important distinction. Thank you for watching. If you liked the video, make sure you hit that thumbs up and subscribe. I appreciate it. We are still growing, and I've noticed that the more old world content I make, the more we grow, so I'm pretty pumped about that. Tomorrow we will have Ultramarines and Drukhari on stream, and then Thursday we will have the game that was supposed to be streaming last week, the Gloomspite Gitz game. Thank you. Big shout out to my hatchling, the real Donnie G, Phoenix, Jamie, Immortals, Lord Wellingstone, Danny Boy, and Captain Too Tall. Thanks a lot. And then links on the screen, links in the description. Have a good day.